This morning, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Michael Blair as our fourth Sunday seminar series speaker. Michael, a member of the Bloor Street congregation, is familiar to all of you much longer than even I am. He is the General Secretary of the United Church of Canada, a role he began almost a year ago. In his time at General Council office, Michael has served as Executive Minister of Ethnic Ministry, Executive Minister of Communities in Ministry and Executive Ministry, Church and Mission. Before joining the General Council staff, Michael served as the Executive Director of the Toronto Christian Resource Centre. Admitted to the Order of Ministry in the United Church in 2010, Michael had previously served as a congregational minister of a number of Baptist churches in Toronto and St. Catharines. As well, he has been a staff member with the InterVarsity Christian Fellowship at the University of Toronto and as a community chaplain with the Ontario Multi-Faith Council's reintegration program. Sometimes our four Sunday speakers speak on their special passions, sometimes of their career interests. Today, Michael combines both his career and his passion as he speaks to us about the United Church towards its third generation. And just before we start, we'll do our usual format. Michael will present. We will follow that with a question and answer time.
Thanks, Mary, for that introduction. Just let me express my own sense of personal appreciation to the Bloor Street community. I've been a part of this community for a fairly long time. The other day I was trying to count up the years, and it's been a long time. And I think it's been the longest I've ever been part of a faith community. Being a minister and moving from time to time doesn't give this sense of longevity, but Bloor Street has been family to me for quite a significant period of time in my life in ministry. And I'm also grateful to contribute to the history of Bloor Street. Bloor Street has a long, rich history in terms of its connection with the wider United Church of Canada. And so I also feel that I've been able to contribute to that, in that the first racialized General Secretary of the United Church of Canada is from the Bloor Street community. So joining the ranks of the first moderator of the United Church of Canada being from Bloor Street. So that is great hope. What I would like to do this morning, this afternoon, or whenever it is to walk you through what I think is where we need to be going as the United Church of Canada. But I want to start by offering some context. Some of this context, many of you probably will be aware of. Some of you, it may be new to you, but I want to do a quick overview of the present context in which the United Church of Canada finds itself. I'm going to share my screen and walk through a couple of slides, and I'd be happy to receive any questions when I'm done. So what I want to kind of just look at this afternoon is the United Church of Canada, its third generation. And I'm picking that up from a conversation that happened at the 39th General Council in 2006 in Thunder Bay, Ontario. And one of the questions that was posed in that conversation was, what purpose lies at the heart of the United Church of Canada in the beginning of its third generation? And I would want to argue that since 2006, the church has been struggling to define itself and to answer that question. One of the ways in which, for me, that's been helpful in thinking about that question of what purpose lies at the heart of the United Church of Canada as it moves into its third generation is a phrase from a prayer that came at the end of that General Council in Thunder Bay. And it's the line which says, "Propel us into your future rooted in the richness of our past. And that is the sense that the future of the church is God's future, not ours. And that future requires of us to be able to be listening where God is already at work in the world and joining God in that, and that we're going to engage that rooted in the richness of our past. And the reality is that we have a rich, deeply rich past as the United Church of Canada, and we need to embrace that and move into the places where God is calling us in this time and his just generation. But what are we up against? And it's important for us to kind of think about what it is that we're up against. So I just want to quickly run through what I think are some context and challenges that face us as we seek to lean into God's future out of the richness of our past. One of the significant challenges before us is that we are facing, and let me just, some of the things I'm going to share in this contextual piece may seem negative. And one of the challenges that we face as a church is that our reality has created this sense of heaviness and a sense of loss. And so I think part of the future for us is to disrupt the narrative of decline that is so much part of our life as the United Church. And in order to disrupt that narrative of decline, in some ways we need to name it and own it as facts, not as what it will be forever. And so just over the past 10 years, between 2009 and 2019, we have lost 17.2% of our preaching places across the country. So we've gone down from over 3,200 preaching places to just over 2,600. And I think the recent numbers is that we have also declined further. Some of you may not know this, that the United Church of Canada loses about 50 congregations a year, whether through closure or amalgamations. So every year we tend to lose about 50 congregations. We have lost 26.5% of our membership. And so in 2019, we were down to just over almost 400,000 in terms of the membership. And one of the challenges of that decline in our membership is this tension between we are named as the largest Protestant church in Canada. And in many ways we are. And if you take the census numbers, the census figures will say that there are over 2 million people who identify with the United Church. And so we have far more people in the Canadian context that because they've had history, they were baptized, they grew up affiliated to the United Church of Canada, they'll name that. But the reality is that our membership is down to less than 400,000 people. And we've lost 37.1% in attendance. And so in 2019, the average attendance across the church was just over 100,000 people. So that gives you a sense of the kind of bit of the challenge that we face as the church. And some of that challenge is also fighting with our history of us being a significant player in the landscape in Canadian religious life. The other challenge we face is property. And it's what we've discovered, or what we're discovering, is that we have a surplus in some ways, in some cases, of property. We have properties that congregations can no longer afford. And one of the things that COVID-19 has proven to us is that there are a lot of congregations who are surviving because they're able to rent the spaces in their building. And so without rental income, thankfully the government assisted some of our congregations, but without rental income, the reality is that many of our congregations can't survive or afford. And that's a real challenge for us. The other challenge with our property is that we didn't know until a couple of years ago where all the properties that the United Church of Canada owned were. And what was interesting is that a few years ago, we were invited to be part of a conversation with a number of developers. And one of the things the developers said to us is that they said, you guys are sitting ducks because we will pick off your properties one at a time because you have no sense of a kind of portfolio understanding of where your properties are. And so one of the challenges, and I'll talk about a response to that later, but one of the challenges for us is property. And as Bloor Street knows, it's been years in the making to try and seek to redevelop that space, but that's an issue for us. So, and one of the challenges around the properties is that there's an unequal distribution of the wealth of those properties across the country. So if you live in urban areas, some of those properties are quite expensive. If you're in a rural area, those properties aren't as expensive in terms of sale. So that's a bit of a challenge for us. The other challenge we have is a challenge around rural and smaller churches. As you know, a lot of rural communities are experiencing a significant depopulation challenge. And so as people are moving out of the rural communities, there are real issues for our rural churches. One of the particular issues that we're facing contextually around our rural and smaller church ministries is the question of ministry leadership. And we have some congregations are being served by licensed lay worship leaders and folks who were intended to be simply a support and a resource to local church communities are now in some ways offering significant leadership to the life of many of our rural and small church communities. We're seeing a growth in designated lay ministers across the country, many of whom are providing support to rural and small church communities because they're folks who live in those areas. We are seeing, again, that sometimes congregational designated ministers are serving congregations. And so the challenge of kind of paid accountable leadership, as in ordered ministers, that's not happening in many of our smaller and rural congregations. And the reality too is that many of our congregations can no longer afford to pay a full-time salary for ministry personnel, and that adds pressure. And we are discovering now and starting to use the language of lay-led congregations. And for instance, Canadian Shield, which is the other region that's affiliated with Shining Waters, are experiencing that a significant number of their congregations are lay-led. And in fact, I think in Shining Waters, I'm not sure if Peter is still here with us. I think there's only 2 ordered ministers in that region of the country. So Saskatchewan, we're finding again quite a significant lay-led kind of congregations, and that's something of our future, but it's an issue and a challenge for us now. the other piece is, sorry, sorry, hang on a second. So the other challenge that we're facing at the moment is the larger question of ministry leadership. And one of the things that we're experiencing in the church is that a significant number of folks who are responding to ministerial leadership call are second generation and are older. You may or may not know that the average age of a minister in the United Church of Canada is 58. So although we are seeing a few younger folks come into ministerial leadership in the life of the church, we're also seeing that we're an older cohort of ministry leadership. In fact, one of our regions 2 years ago ordained a 70-year-old to Word and Sacrament. So we're seeing a significant, and that has all kinds of challenges for us and pressures on the pension plan and other parts. But there's a lot of issues that we need to resolve around our understanding of ministry leadership in the life of the church. The other challenge before us is the kind of changing demographics of the Canadian population. And part of that is we are facing individuals who are suspicious of religious institutions, who are no longer interested in anything kind of religious. We're seeing, and especially recently with the discovery of the unmarked graves, that folks are lumping all churches into this basket of doing some horrific things to the lives of people. We're seeing more and more people from the global south who are coming into the Canadian landscape. There are people who come, people of faith who come, but find the United Church to be quite inaccessible for a whole host of reasons. In fact, there are people from United Churches who come to Canada and don't find the United Church accessible. There are people from the Methodist stream who come and don't find the United Church accessible. So there's some, as the shift is going on in the Canadian society, it has an impact on the life of the United Church of Canada. You may not be able to see this, and I'll just, a significant part of our challenge is around our finances. When you look at this graph, you may say, what problems do we have with finances? So for instance, combined across Canada, we raised over $400 million for the work of the United Church of Canada as a whole. And that is not monies that come to the General Council office, but it's monies that local congregations raise in terms of paying salaries, taking care of their properties, doing their ministry. So on one hand, it seems like given the number of givers and the membership and the attendance, we're doing extremely well. The challenge is that at the level of the kind of denominational services, we're just not having the resources to do the work that folks want us to do. So you can see there 2,649 congregations nationally raised around $423 million for the work of the church. But finances is a incredible challenge for us. I'll talk about that in a little while. And then the restructuring, in 2019, we restructured. One of the challenges with our restructuring process is that it started in 2009. It never came to fruition until 2018. and we moved into a new structure in 2019. We've gone from 4 courts to 3 councils, the local community of faith governing group, the regional council, and the denominational council, often referred to as the general council. We established the Office of Vocation to oversee ministry personnel, and that's been put in place, and there are some challenges with that needs to be attended to in the next couple of years. And then we've moved to a system of assessments where congregations are assessed 4.5% of their income towards the support of governance in both the regional and the denominational council level. And that's where part of the challenge is for us, in that what we actually need to do the work is not accessible to us. And in fact, we're seeing, you've heard over the last number of years that every couple of years we've had to reduce staff at the general council office, and part of that reduction often means that we reduce staff, but we don't reduce the work, and so we need to manage the work a bit differently. The Indigenous Church is part of the contextual reality for us now. We have churches on Indigenous church communities that don't have washrooms. The Indigenous Church experience the same kind of challenges that we in the United Church, we in the settler part of the church experience, in terms of we're an older crowd. So can you imagine going to worship as an older adult and no accessibility to washrooms and the implications of that for life together? So that's an important piece. COVID is another part of our context. And again, as I mentioned earlier, COVID has clarified for us some issues around buildings and the fact that our congregations aren't able to support themselves. COVID has reminded us of the challenge of technology, and this morning has been a good example of some of that challenges, but it's broader. So there are communities of faith who have no access to technology. There are communities of faith in part of the country who the bandwidth is not accessible and available to them. And so in some ways, part of COVID and the lack of both access to technology, but expertise in helping to work on technology has created almost a two-tiered system. So, there's some churches who can't do, and so the minister prints a bulletin, prints their sermon, and they deliver it to people in the congregation for a Sunday morning. No access to in person. Some are using Zoom, some are using Facebook Live or YouTube. And so the kind of accessibility that we have at Bloor Street, where at least we can see each other, we're seeing each other in real time, we can wave, we can chat. Some of our communities of faith doesn't have access to that. And so part of moving forward for us is to kind of think around how we're going to support communities of faith around the piece of technology. And the reality is that many of our ministry personnel in this pandemic time are very close to burnout and aren't able to kind of sustain what's required of them. Many of us wasn't trained to function in this kind of environment, and so that's a challenge for us. So that's just a context, and I've been selective. I'm trying to be brief, and because I think some of the value will be our conversation together. So with that as our context, what does it mean for us moving into this third generation of the United Church of Canada? So one of the first things to say is that in all the work that the church has been doing around restructuring, one of the things we have heard over and over and over again was the need for a clear kind of mission vision statement. And so since I became General Secretary, one of the things that I've initiated with the executive is to develop a strategic plan that would begin by clarifying a kind of mission vision for the life of the church. And so just yesterday, the General Council executive, the General Council, the recall General Council 43 met and approved a mission statement and vision statement for the life of the church. I'm going to share with you a short video that lists that up, and then I'll come back.
Deep spirituality.
Deep spirituality.
Une spiritualité profonde.
Deep spirituality.
Deep spirituality.
Bold discipleship.
Une vie de disciple
Bold
dynamique.
discipleship.
Bold discipleship.
Bold discipleship.
Une quête audacieuse de justice.
Daring justice.
Daring justice.
Daring justice.
Daring justice.
These are words that express the intent of all the major statements made by the United Church of Canada over the last number of years.
We live in a world that is largely individualistic. And when I think of discipleship, I think of commitment to God, commitment to a life following Christ, but also commitment to one another.
It's really about how we're working to live and do our ministry together as this United Church of Canada.
We have to dare to love. We have to dare to dream of a world in which love reigns. And I think this is the ultimate test for modern Christians.
Whether it's men in the world, justice-seeking, justice-living church, towards 2025. It's found in our Song of Faith and in the new creed.
Ceux-ci sont les piliers de qu'est-ce que ça veut dire d'être l'Église de l'avenir. C'est sur cette base que nous pourrions être capables de répondre à l'appel de Dieu.
These words.
Deep spirituality. Bold discipleship.
Daring justice.
Is an expression of who we are as the United Church of Canada.
This is our call. Let's make it our commitment.
This is the mission that has been articulated and approved for the United Church over the next 3 years. We will be engaging in animating that across the church. We'll be providing resources, inviting communities of faith, regional councils, incorporated ministries, anybody who flies the flag of the United Church to think about what does that mean for them in their context. And I think in some ways for us, it's this kind of North Star to kind of help us as a denomination be very clear about what it is that we are about as the United Church of Canada. And the vision statement that we are offering to the church is this as well: called by God into disciples, as disciples of Jesus, the United Church of Canada aspires to become a brave, connected, evolving church, a church of diverse communities carried by courage and hope, united by deep spirituality, creators of liturgy, inspiring, and a bold quest for justice. And so we're seeing that as a starting point for our collective work as the United Church of Canada. And as part of that strategic plan, we've identified 5 strategic objectives, which for the next 3 years, we will try to live into. It will govern the work that is done out of the General Council office. And the 5 objectives that we have named are to embolden justice. And so one of the things we will do is that we will define 3 significant areas of our work in the justice portfolio that we will animate across the church. It doesn't mean that we won't animate other issues, justice issues, but we will encourage networks to do that work. And so, for instance, the GLI is being done by a network. The General Council office provides limited support to a group of folks who are passionate about GLI, and we're encouraging, and we hope that's the kind of stuff we'll see across the church. We have named a leadership as an important part of that, and we're not talking about only paid accountable leadership, but we're talking about lay leadership. So in some ways, it's nothing new. We're going back to pieces that we thought were a thing. We have identified what we call nurturing the common good, and we want to look at equitable and sustainable sharing of resources across the church. We want to deepen our integrity around climate, and then we want to strengthen invitation, which is about how do we begin to retell the story of the gospel to a new generation of Canadians. And so that's a significant part of the work towards the future of the church. So here are the mission: deep spirituality, bold discipleship, and daring justice. The second piece that as we move into this third generation is that we've set up a corporation called the United Property Resource Corporation. The United Church of Canada is the only stakeholder, and it's a group that we have established to help us manage our properties across the country. At this point in time, it's still voluntary for individual communities of faith to engage with the UPRC. We are hoping that as part of the strategic plan, we will develop a national property policy across the country. And one of the significant things that UPRC brings to us is the opportunity to say, the first question is, what is your mission as a community of faith? And how does your property work into that mission? And from that starting point to begin to think about what are the opportunities of redevelopment. You may have seen this picture on the news, but this is the proposed redevelopment of St. Luke's United Church down on Carton Street. The Indigenous church is another, and I think part of this next generation will be the strength of the Indigenous church among us. We're responding to the caretaker's call, the call to the church. We are trying to work through issues of reconciliation and reparation. And we are trying to understand the new structures of the church, of the Indigenous church, and what it means for this church to be an independent, self-governing church in relationship with the rest of the settler church community. And that's a piece of the work going into the future. Faithful Footprints is another piece, and this is our attempt to address the issues of climate and the impact of our building. And I'll just share a quick video.
Across the planet,
Can you hear?
The climate crisis is growing. It's a pressing issue that requires urgent action. The hopeful news? We can see the shift towards a low-carbon future starting to happen. The United Church of Canada is committing to reducing our carbon emissions by 80% by 2050, in line with the Paris climate targets. We're partnering with Faith in the Common Good to launch Faithful Footprints, providing tools and grants that support congregations to meet that target. The energy used to light and heat United Church buildings is one of our largest sources of carbon emissions, and it's also one of our biggest expenses. So our first focus will be to engage with 500 congregations by 2025 to improve the energy efficiency of their buildings and to share lessons they can take into their homes and workplaces.
Through doing a whole building energy audit, we've realized how much we are just polluting unnecessarily and ways that we can save not only money, but to cut down our carbon dioxide emissions.
The income from the solar system would pay for the solar installation itself in 8 years, and over the remaining 25 years of their loan would pay for the new steel roof that they installed and the repairs to the eaves. The solar income really adds to the bank account of the church.
We recognize that to bring truly inspiring climate leadership to our communities, we must first put our own house in order. Together, we can renew our congregations, care for the planet, save money, and stop climate pollution. Faithful Footprints is about living our climate commitments for future generations and for all of creation. Find out more and get your congregation involved at faithfulfootprints.org.
So again, as we move into this third generation, we cannot do that without being attentive to the issues of the climate crisis that we face ourselves in, and to address that in significant ways. So that's a piece. The next thing we are working on is the work that's assigned to us about anti-racism and a larger equity framework. And that's going to engage us going forward. I think the church has come to a place both in terms of its relationship with the indigenous peoples of this land, but also some of the historic newcomers of to the country, whether it's with Koreans, Chinese, Japanese, people of African descent. All that work needs to be done. So we're working on one of the things that's going on right now is 40 days of engagement around anti-racism, and you can find information on the United Church website. We're doing equity audits. We're looking at all of our policies to make sure that we are not unintentionally causing harm to various communities in the life of the church. And we're doing some significant anti-racism training for different folks within the life of the church. The next piece quickly is that I think we are going to have to be working at how we engage with the new populations coming into Canada. And one of those places is what we're calling the migrant church. We've developed a few pieces to enable us to do that. One is what's called the associate relations. And we're particularly inviting and working with folks who come into Canada from Methodist background. Currently, we work with folks from Ghana, the Philippines, Zimbabwe, Haiti, and Korea as part of this associate relations piece. And then we're also working on what we call mutual recognition of ministry with the United Church of Christ in the Philippines and with the Presbyterian Church in the Republic of Korea. And so those are part of this third wave is how we engage with people who are coming in. And then ecumenical partnerships is another piece so full communion partnerships. We have a full communion partnership with the United Church of Christ in the US and with the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in the US and Canada as well. And we're exploring sharing the space at Bloor Street with the Presbyterians and the Anglican Church of Canada, and conversations are in line to do that. So that's some of the challenges and some of the opportunities as the United Church moves into its third generation, and I'll stop there. Thanks. So a couple of things. I think the executive is struggling with how to have the conversation about reparations. So in some ways, this notion of land back is not necessarily something that United Church has embraced. Okay. We've done some work. We've done some work on the theology of land, and we're trying to wrestle with that piece. But a fundamental question for us is, what does reparation as part of our reconciliation mean? And that's a conversation that I think is still needs to be had. The second thing is that the Indigenous Church keeps reminding us that we do a disservice when we just talk about the Indigenous Church, because the reality is that we're talking about multiplicity of nations, and that there is no, there's not one voice within the Indigenous Church circle, and so the challenge of being able to figure out, and the leadership within the Indigenous Church are also figuring out what that means and what that means for us, right? So an example is pipelines. Whose voice do we listen to? Because some of the Indigenous communities are supportive and some aren't. So there's that kind of tension that we're working on. There are opportunities for us there's some opportunities that have come our way recently about returning land. So we just, in September, approved the return of a piece of property to two Indigenous communities in BC. They're side by side, and there's this piece of property that we own that used to have a church on it that we haven't used for years, and the request has come and we have said yes. In just outside of London, we've just returned a piece of property to the communities there. So when the opportunities come, we are moving in that direction. In terms of UPRC, one of the things that UPRC has done is, one, we're working with an Indigenous architect on the design and development of UPRC. UPRC has committed, and they are working at it. So in terms of its purchasing power, it's named that it wants to purchase from Indigenous-owned business, and it's again, like the church as a whole, we're struggling to understand what that is. So I would say it's a conversation that is in progress. Yeah. And it will take some time for us, I think, to get there. And the rhythm. So I'll use an example. So as you may have read, we identified $3 million to be available to the 30 Indigenous communities that were impacted by the residential schools. So we sent letters to these communities, say we want to be in conversation in terms of how we may be able to respond, and we don't have a preconceived idea what that response is going to be. So the moderator and I have been meeting with chiefs and council of some of these communities. One of the chiefs and council we're meeting with, we've had 3 meetings, a 4th meeting is planned, and to date, there is no ask. The time has been to build relationships. So again, it's working with the rhythms of the community. Anyhow, long way to answer your question, but it's an unresolved question for us that is still on the table, and we're still engaging. In 4 years, we celebrate our 100th anniversary. as a founding of the United Church of Canada. And I think that this notion is that, we've had 2025 will kind of start the kind of third generation of the United Church of Canada. So we've come through kind of 2 generations so far, and 2025 will shape that. The reality when we think about that is that there's even some of you in this room today remember the good old days of the United Church when we were bursting at the seams, and and we've come through a generation. So one of the generation would be probably say from 2025 to probably the 60s. We had this kind of upswing in the 60s, but virtually from the mid 60s, we've been in decline. So there's a generation that lives with the reality that the United Church, number-wise, influence-wise, impact, and then we're issuing into this third generation where the memory is for all intents and purposes gone. So we have to find new ways to re-articulate who we are as this community of faith, one that is no longer is in a privileged position, one that is on the margins, one who, the basis of union guaranteed ministry, continuous ministry for those of us who are ministry personnel. That reality is gone. And the third generation is, we're going to see bivocational ministry. We're going to see a rise in lay-led congregations. There's just all kinds of stuff. So that third generation is kind of what's on the horizon. We're moving there. I think we're there, but we're moving there as we move into 2025. Well, we're not sure. Hybrid would work for those congregations who can do it, right? Not everybody can do that. So that's one challenge. Hybrid congregation has all kinds of issues for ministry personnel. As I said earlier, most of our ministry personnel wasn't trained to be in this space. And, Martha and David and Russ can tell you how much work it's been to kind of pivot it into this space. So I think the hybrid reality is a reality for us. How that will look, we're still it's in process, because as I said, there's the access to technology. I think we need to be talking about, not every congregations have to be hybrid. Can we work collaboratively across a number of congregations to have a presence? So to me, there's some really exciting kinds of conversation that are on the horizon. Part of it too is, do we need to be in conversation with Anglicans and Lutherans and others in terms of how we do ministry together in this new reality that we find ourselves in? So some kind of hybridity is in our future. How that looks and how that plays out will be quite interesting. So I would say a couple of things. One is, sometimes we kind of overestimate youth interested in what we're doing. Sorry. And so we just need to be careful of that, I think, in some ways, that in some ways we need to find out what youth and young people want. I think secondly, one of the biggest challenge, and I think in some ways, one of the opportunities for us is that we have to create new expressions of the United Church of Canada, because the reality is that many of us are set in our own ways. A few years ago, I was doing a workshop, and I said to folks that you're all in Toronto, so you'll understand this, that oftentimes you go to places, some of the subways in the city, and you will hear classical music being played. I enjoy them because I know those songs to hymn tunes, and it used to drive my kids crazy because I'd be at the subway and I'd be humming hymn tunes. But do you know why they use classical music? Keep the kids out. So, so I think part of the practicality of it for me is that if we really want to encourage kids and young people into the life of our community, we have to be prepared to give up some of what we're doing now to be to make the space accessible to youth and young adults. And many of us, myself included, as much as I miss certain kinds of music and that kind of stuff, when the organ starts on a Sunday morning, I feel incredibly at home. And to be in a situation where I'm not hearing that on a regular basis isn't totally comfortable for me. So the reality is that we're in a time when we're going to have to be, say, there are multiple expressions of the United Church of Canada across the country. The reality is, folks, is that in Toronto, let me talk about Toronto. In Toronto, there are no options. On a Sunday morning, no matter which of our congregations you land into, you know the script. The only thing that's different is different voices reading the scriptures, and the sermon is different. But, you know, for the most part, if you want something else rather than 3 hymns and organ and scripture and a sermon, there's no accessibility to it in Toronto. And so unless we're prepared to say the United Church, given our history and given what we believe and given all that kind of stuff, could allow itself to have multiple kinds of expression across this country, we're not going to reach our young adults because, frankly, we have nothing to offer them because what we do is stuff that is meant to scare them off. Sorry, I'm being strong on that, but it's a problem for me. Sorry, I shouldn't bring my personal stuff into this. And we're experimenting. So we've been spending some money experimenting in possibilities. So in Vancouver, there's a congregation that exists only online.
Right.
In Quebec, there's a congregation that exists only online. And we're trying to figure out, you know, one of the larger questions for us is to start to think about what we understand membership to be, right? And how do you develop a community that's virtual and not, you know, and I think that's part of our future. There's a congregation in Vancouver that bought a coffee shop that they run as a coffee shop, and they do discussion groups and they do their worship in the coffee shop. That imagining what it means to be church, and I think that's this, for me, this leaning into God's future out of the richness of our past is this willingness to risk. That's such a significant part of our history. We are risk takers. So why can't we risk doing church differently? Because that's what the third generation is calling from us. Notion around, can we reimagine what church is? So I got myself into trouble when I first came into the United Church. I was asked by the then Toronto conference to preach the celebration of ministry service. And I said, in some circles, I'm still known for this, that what you offer has to be better than nookie. I think families are rushing and go all over the place all the time. Sunday mornings is often the time when parents can sleep in and enjoy being together. So you have to give them something that's better than that. and so part of the challenge is maybe our children's ministry don't happen on a Sunday morning as we have done so ad infinitum. Maybe our children's ministry happen some other time and in some other form. So I think the thing is that we keep expecting the same results with what we have rather than kind of playing with what we have, right? So Sunday morning may not be the best time to be doing children's ministry. So if we're serious about engaging a part of the population, then we're going to have to think about how we do that. Again, let me just switch it up a little bit. So I'm an immigrant. I'm working 2 or 3 jobs to put food on the table. And I often, because of the kind of jobs I get, I'm working Sunday mornings, right? Mm-hmm. Well, if Sunday is my only opportunity to be together with a community of faith, it's not going to happen, right? But can the community of faith say, if we're going to reach these folks or engage these folks in our life, what does that mean? What do we have to give up, or what do we have to change in order to reach out and be a place of welcome? I'm using the language accessible. How does our communities become accessible to the folks who we're missing that we want to be part of us? And that may mean we're meeting Saturday afternoons, we're meeting after school on a Wednesday night or whatever. I think we just have to be creative and to say that it's not going to work the way we do it now. And I think that's so part of the challenge for us, I think, as a church. You know, I started by saying we have to disrupt this narrative of decline. And part of that disruption of the narrative of decline is a disruption about the way in which we think about what it means to be church, because our future lies in church being different from what it is now. And I think that's a challenge. And from where I sit and my experience, you know, I'm a newcomer to the United Church. I don't have the history in the United Church that many of you have, but from where I sit in the life of this church, I recognize that this church in its history has the capacity to embrace change in a way that it's been lazy to do in the last 20 years.
Thank you, Michael. Michael, I feel so hopeful today. I hope that the rest do as well. Thank you for helping us begin this journey into the 3rd generation. Thank you for perhaps giving us a kick in the pants that we need to think about where we're going as a congregation and as a church. Thank you also for helping us recognize the building blocks of the past, but the building blocks of the future. It sounds amazing what United Church Canada has done so far to begin this journey, and I think it's exciting as we head to the 100th anniversary. So thank you so much for all of that.